Okay, I want to welcome you all to this press conference. My name is Steve Zeltzer. I'm with No Nukes Action. This is an emergency press conference statewide and nationally because we were basically prevented from knowing what was going on until very recently about this new bill, SB 846, that's been introduced. We found out about it Wednesday. It was only printed on Sunday night. So the 33 million people of California really don't even know what's in this bill. And there's been no real publicity about the bill. And it has a very devastating effect for solar industry, devastating effect for the people of San Luis Obispo who do not want a nuclear ticking time bomb in their neighborhood. And so we'll have a number of speakers. And then if journalists who are attending want to put their name and question in, we can do that. If you put in your contact information, we can get back to you. And also the panelists and others can put their contact information. And so we'll start the press conference, and thanks for joining us today. So our first speaker is Linda Seeley. She's with Mothers for Peace in San Luis Obispo and has been in a decades-long struggle to defend the community, defend the people of San Luis Obispo around this nuclear power plant. So welcome, Linda.
She's muted.
We still need permission to record.
Sorry, thank you. I'm Linda Seeley from San Luis Obispo Mothers for Peace, and we've been fighting Diablo Canyon since 1973. And our chief concerns are safety and the environment. And this bill just devastates both of the major concerns that we have. And we're also concerned about the solar, the terrible damage it does to the solar industry and to rooftop solar in our state. Well, the first thing I want to talk about is this alleged five-year extension of the license to operate. That's in the bill, but PG&E has stated publicly at the Diablo Canyon decommissioning engagement panel that they will apply for a 20-year license extension. It only makes sense for them to apply for 20 years. That's how long license extensions are with the Nuclear Regulatory Commission. And that I want to remind everybody about the 2016 agreement when we had a final date for the shutdown of Diablo Canyon, which was going to be in 2024 and 2025, that we were resting assured with that. So I just want to remind everybody that there is no assurance that this bill is going to stop Diablo Canyon after 5 years. And if you believe what they say, then you have definitely drunk the Kool-Aid. Also, this bill, SB 846, categorically exempts from CEQA, which is California Environmental Quality Act, the Diablo Canyon Power Plant site, all structures, buildings, and equipment necessary to extend operations. That includes the embrittled reactor vessel. The reactor vessel is the place where the nuclear reaction takes place. And that reactor vessel, which Arnie Gunderson is going to talk about later on today, is embrittled. And he'll tell you what that means. We have on the decommissioning panel, one of our members has requested from PG&E about the details of the embrittled reactor vessel. PG&E wrote back this morning and said that that is proprietary information, refusing to give it to the panel member. We consulted with one of the retired NRC commissioners who says that's absolutely untrue. It is not proprietary information. and three other nuclear engineers who also say it's not proprietary information. So this embrittled reactor vessel is one of the most important, not important, I mean, lethal things that could happen to the whole state of California. And they want to keep it running for another 5 to 20 years. Okay, so another part of this bill is that under SB 846, PG&E could mismanage the plant, even commit gross negligence, and still be held harmless against any of the outcomes. And at the same time, the shareholders will get record profits. I mean, what a sweet deal for PG&E. It's almost incomprehensible that this is possibly going to pass. We already have over 3.5 million pounds of highly radioactive nuclear waste at the site. It's stored both in the spent fuel pools and in the dry cask storage adjacent to the plant. When you look at the place where the dry cask storage is, it's on these pads, concrete pads that are 7.5 feet thick. There is exactly enough space on those concrete pads to hold the waste that's going to be created through 2025. So if this plant stays in operation, that means that the spent fuel pools are going to get more and more and more loaded with this highly radioactive, the most toxic substance that's ever been created on the face of the earth, built on at least 4 earthquake faults, really 13 earthquake faults, but who's counting? To go on for an undetermined amount of time. Another point is the refurbishment that's going to have to be done before that plant can continue to operate, or maybe they won't make it, maybe they won't allow or force PG&E, maybe the NRC won't make PG&E refurbish everything that needs to be refurbished, since they quit doing a lot of the maintenance back in 2016 because they were going to shut down. But that is absolutely unknown, the cost of how much it would be to refurbish the plant to get it to a safe level to operate longer, although there is no way it could be safe. And then the last thing is that about the hidden solar tax, it's just reprehensible. And I'm sure other people are going to talk about that, but it is unconscionable that they allowed that to come into this bill. PG&E has been convicted of 84 counts of involuntary manslaughter. It's about to receive a huge prize in the form of $1.4 billion in a gift to create even more of the most toxic stuff in the entire world for an undetermined amount of time. It's absolutely unconscionable. It's immoral. It ought to be illegal. Thanks. That's all I have to say.
Thank you, Linda. And maybe you can put the link to your group's organization on the website so people can check out your information. So our next speaker is Daniel.
Steve, I hate to interrupt, but people are asking for the ability to record. Numerous people have asked.
Unfortunately, I didn't come in through Zoom, so I haven't been able to get that. So what I'm going to do is I'll put in, I'm going to send out the entire video from the web.
It is recording right now.
Press conference, yeah.
Okay, and can you make me a co-host, please?
I can't do that either as well. So
Okay.
I should have come in through Zoom. I didn't, so that's the reason I can't do it. So, but anyway, I think we should, let's proceed. So our next speaker is Daniel Hirsch. He's with Committee to Bridge the Gap. Daniel.
Muted. Sometime between 8 p.m. and around midnight tomorrow, the state legislature is being forced to make what may be the most momentous decision ever made in the state of California for the health and safety of the people here. The governor put into print at 7:56 on Sunday night a bill to extend the life of the aging and decrepit Diablo Canyon nuclear plant. He did that because the Constitution requires 3 days advance notice before there can be a vote. And this was to be jammed through so that there could be almost no scrutiny of such an extraordinarily, potentially catastrophic action. I want to explain for a moment why it is so monumental, what's at stake, and I'll do a bit of screen sharing in a moment. Inside each of the reactors at Diablo Canyon, there is the equivalent of 1,000 times the long-lived radioactivity of the Hiroshima bomb. In technical terms, there are about 15 billion curies of radioactivity inside each reactor, meaning that there are about 500 billion emissions of radiation a second. The only way that that public is protected is if that radioactivity stays inside the core. The only way that happens is if it's constantly cooled. So if an earthquake occurs, if there is sabotage or a terrorist attack, if a worker makes the wrong decision, we can have a release of an extraordinary amount of radioactivity. Essentially a Fukushima on the California coast, but unlike Fukushima where the wind blew most of the radioactivity out to sea, the winds would bring the radioactivity inland to Central Valley or to Southern California or Northern California, depending on which way the wind blows. So let me show you what's at stake, if I can, for a moment. We can do screen sharing. And Diablo was built based on PG&E's assertion that there were no active earthquake faults within about 30 kilometers of the site. The local community group that intervened wanted to put on an expert witness in the hearings to demonstrate that there were faults nearby, and PG&E in its wisdom objected, and the licensing board voted 2-1 to prohibit that testimony. They got the license, and a few months later, Hoskins and Griffiths published their paper showing that there was an active earthquake fault called the Hosgri fault just offshore, capable of an earthquake far larger than the plant was designed to withstand. PG&E initially denied it and eventually had to admit to it, but by that time, 80% of the plant was completed. And rather than upgrade the plant or abandon it, they just asked the NRC essentially for a waiver to allow the plant to be built with an exception for the Hosgri fault. That, by a vote of 3-2, was allowed by the NRC. Two courageous commissioners, Victor Galinsky and Peter Bradford, objected. If there had been one more vote, there would not have been the Diablo Canyon plant built at all. But PG&E said, don't worry, there won't be any more faults found. But then the San Luis Bay fault was discovered nearby, and the Osas fault was discovered nearby. And then most troubling, the shoreline fault was discovered, which is within 600 meters of the plant and about 300 meters from the plant intakes. And these faults are capable of earthquakes larger than the plant was designed to withstand. It gets worse. PG&E claimed that there were no connections between these faults. If the faults are connected, the longer the fault, generally the more earthquake shaking can occur. They said there were no connections, but then they had to admit that the Hosgri was connected to a nearby fault. And then they, sorry, it's not moving, there we go. Then they claimed that the Hosgri and the San Simeon faults weren't connected. And then they had to admit that they were Hosgri, San Simeon, and San Gregorio faults connected. And finally, they now had to admit that there could be a joint rupture along the Hosgri, San Simeon, San Gregorio fault zone, which runs from south of the reactors to north of San Francisco. So they began with the claim of no active faults within 30 kilometers and no interconnections. And now it's known that there are 4 nearby faults and several interconnections. I stop sharing. PG&E testified on Thursday and Friday before the legislature that don't worry, there is a resident NRC inspector on site, and if it were unsafe, they would shut it down. But the senior resident inspector at the time, Dr. Michael Peck, indeed concluded it was unsafe, violating its license and should be shut down. And rather than shutting it down, the NRC transferred him back east. So we have a toothless regulator and a criminal utility, one that's been found guilty of numerous crimes that have resulted in numerous deaths. And you know that, for example, Judge Alsop, who oversaw PG&E's handling of safety issues, said, in these 5 years, PG&E has been on a crime spree and will emerge from probation as a continuing menace to California. And even Governor Newsom, as recently as 2019 in the New York Times, said about PG&E, they have simply been caught red-handed over and over again, lying, manipulating, or misleading the public. So you have a terribly dangerous mix. 15 billion curies of radioactivity in each reactor, the ability for that to get released if there's a loss of cooling resulting in melting, a criminal utility that really doesn't want this facility license extended and is being pressured into it. So a mix of an incompetent and reluctant utility and the most dangerous energy technology on Earth is a very, very toxic gas. What is most perhaps troubling is the process for a moment. And that is that the governor didn't want this proposal to be considered with the deliberation of the legislature. The normal process of introducing it, having it go to a policy committee, an appropriations committee, the floor, amendments, testimony, and all that. So he's released it at the last moment. And you only do that if you know that something can't withstand scrutiny. Now, if this was just a minor matter of passing money on to a big contributor or something, it would be bad, but not horrendous. But jamming through something that could result in the release of this massive amount of radioactivity and trying to do that in the last few hours of session is extremely disturbing. Let me end with this observation. This is all occurring at the same time that there is a reactor complex in Ukraine that is under fire, that had offsite power disrupted twice about a week ago. If you lose offsite power, you can lose cooling if your diesel generators fail, or if you run out of diesel fuel. At the same time that the world's attention is focused on those reactors in Ukraine, where a release can result in contaminating a large portion of Ukraine and Europe, we in California, for frankly craven political reasons, are placing at risk this state to have a release of the very sort that we're frightened can occur in Ukraine. So my deep, deep concern is that one of the most momentous decisions ever made in the state is being jammed through the legislature in the last few hours of session with no real consideration of the potential consequences, which could be immense. Thank you. Steve, you muted yourself.
Sorry, thank you, Daniel. And our next speaker is Donna Gilmore with San Onofre Safety. Welcome, Donna.
Hey, thank you. After I heard about this bill, I went to check Diablo Canyon's safety record and uptime. The bill, the only reason the bill is being justified is we need Diablo Canyon, both reactors up, for reliability, or we will have blackouts. That's the fear campaign. So I did my research, and on the NRC database, where did it go? Here we go. This is what I found. One or both reactors have been down 40% of the days in every year. Why is that going to? Okay. So you can see, look at 2008, 163 days, 2019, 149. So all these days, these were planned and unplanned outages. So how can they, Governor Newsom, support the claim that these reactors can both be up when they're down, or at least one or two are down 40% of the days in the year? This should be the Kill Bill event here, because that's, you know, that's a whole house of cards here. And I researched the reasons for the downs. Some were planned for maintenance and refueling. Some were because they looked at for example, they looked at this pump that was getting corroded by the ocean and said, well, we'll put that off later. And then later they had to have an emergency shutdown of the reactor. So, you know, you don't need Ukrainians or Russians. We got PG&E, you know. And then to make matters worse, they want PG&E to have an open checkbook. They're going to get an open checkbook, whatever it costs And they're not telling us whatever it costs to get this reactor up to where it can run another 20 years. We have to pay for it. All the Californians have to pay for it. All the ratepayers in the other utilities, San Diego Gas and Electric, Southern California Edison, and the CCAs are going to have to pay for Diablo Canyon and overpay for all of this. This is insane. This was not mentioned in either the Senate or Assembly hearings. And this is crucial information that should be the kill bill event of this bill. And I have a lot of other issues, but for the sake of time, I'll let other speakers continue.
Okay, thank you. And also, you should put your website up on the chat, Donna.
Okay.
So our next speaker is Andrew Christie. He's director of the St. Lucia chapter of the Sierra Club. Welcome, Andrew.
Can't hear him.
If you're Mikey 129, you need to unmute and perhaps rename yourself.
I am unmuted.
There you go.
Don't know how to do the rename. Hopefully the host can do that.
Maybe you can rename him, Myla. I made you co-host. I was able to make you co-host. Okay, why don't you begin, Andrew?
Yes, I am Andrew Christie. I'm the director of the Santa Lucia chapter of the Sierra Club. That is the Sierra Club chapter that represents all of our members in San Luis Obispo County. Our relations with Diablo Canyon go back to the late 1960s, and they are long and fraught. And we are not happy to see them potentially continuing for another 5 to 10 years beyond the point where they should have stopped. I wanted to amplify on Linda Seeley's point regarding the exemption from the California Environmental Quality Act at the Diablo site that the bill promises. That is in reference directly to the outfall permit for the plant, where the cooling water that they sucked out of the ocean goes back into the ocean much warmer than it was when it came out, and which has earned the plant the sobriquet, the largest marine predator in California. That's not just bad news for the environmental review of Diablo in this bill. It's bad news for the California Environmental Quality Act, because the way that section is written, 25548.2, it is open-ended enough to be seized upon by any developer of any project in the future who can simply claim the precedent of Diablo, that there's something like an existing use or any facility currently on that site, and they're simply expanding it, and therefore they too are exempt from the California Environmental Quality Act. That is, of course, only one of the problems with this bill. There are actually some nice things in the bill. The Clean Energy Reliability Investment Plan, which I believe was imported from the counter proposal by the State Assembly, is certainly a good thing. It's something the state should be doing to increase renewable energy and energy storage and energy efficiency. And that is something the state could certainly do at any time in any other bill without ironically tying a boat anchor to it in the form of the state's 40-year-old last remaining nuclear power plant. The approach of this bill is essentially tiptoeing up to a license renewal, and then afterwards throwing cascades of monitoring and reporting requirements on it, which looks like the legislative version of a frog in a pan of warm water sitting on the stove. Basically, go ahead and take the action, and then on the fly, do everything you need to do to determine whether or not that was a bad idea. And I would say there is a simpler way to go about that. Simply vote no on this bill, adjourn, come back in the next session, and work on speeding up the transition to a 21st century renewable energy economy without the relic of the 20th century energy economy getting in the way. Thanks.
Okay, thank you, Andrew. Our next speaker is Harvey Wasserman. He's an author, historian, and radio host on KPFK and KPFA, on KPFK. So welcome, Harvey.
Thank you for having me. This is a good conference. Thank you so much. Just for those of you interested, I will be on KGO at 1 p.m. with Pat Thurston today as soon as this conference is over, if you want to listen in and call. And I'm a Los Angeles resident. I have children and grandchildren in Los Angeles. I've been with the nuclear issue since the 70s. Back then, you had to have an evacuation plan to have a license. And the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, of course, let this go. But I would like to see the evacuation plan for Los Angeles. If there is, God forbid, a major accident, someone is screen sharing here, Marta Stern. If God forbid there's an accident at Diablo Canyon, and we've been going here for all these years for the grace of God. The only reason that the Diablo Canyon hasn't turned into an apocalypse is that we haven't had an earthquake. God knows we're overdue. Dr. Michael Peck, the new NRC site inspector, long ago said that those two reactors cannot withstand credible earthquakes. And basically, we're playing Fukushima roulette here. It's outrageous. So let the governor show us the evacuation plan for Los Angeles, please, before there's anything goes further. I will say about the process. Gavin Newsom was party to the agreement to shut Diablo in 2016. He's been rolling along. In 2019, we specifically asked him with a petition signed by 2,500 people, including Jane Fonda, Lily Tomlin, Martin Sheen, Eric Roberts, Ed Asner. We asked him to please inspect Unit 1 because we know it's embrittled, but we don't know how embrittled it is and whether pipes are breaking and so on. And Gavin Newsom in 2019 refused to inspect either reactor. How do you continue operating 50-year-old, 40-year-old machines if they're not inspected? Our cars in California have to be inspected, and they also have to be insured. Diablo Canyon has no insurance. There is a $13 billion fund or thereabouts, which will cover the damage maybe to half of Avila Beach, and the trillions of dollars in damage that will be done by Diablo Canyon if and when it blows up, for God's sakes, have no insurance. I have a home in Los Angeles. I've read the insurance policy. There is a specific exemption. If Diablo Canyon blows up, God forbid, and a radioactive cloud covers my house in the valley, I get nothing. Nobody gets anything. There is no insurance. It's outrageous. It's even more outrageous now that they've thrown in a bill to kill solar. What sane energy planner in 2022 kills rooftop solar in California while arguing that we need the power from a nuclear power plant? That is the definition of bad faith and of insanity. And we are all at risk from here. We're all uninsured. And, we got to stop playing Fukushima roulette. I will end by saying in 1977, I marched in Japan with thousands of Japanese citizens who specifically said, do not build nuclear power plants in a zone washed by tsunamis and shaken by earthquakes. And TEPCO and the Japanese government laughed at us and said, forget it, it's not going to happen. We know it happened. We have been warning exactly the same thing at Diablo Canyon for 50 years. And these people, not only don't these people listen, but they have no morals and no ethics in pushing through this extension, and we have to stop it. Thank you very much. I appreciate your time.
Thank you, Harvey. So our next speaker is Arnie Gunderson with the Fairwinds Energy Education Group. Welcome, Arnie.
Hi, Arnie Gunderson here. For those of you that are reporters, it's Gunderson, S-E-N, and Fairwinds has an E in the middle of it. I'll shoot through some credentials real quick. I have a bachelor's and master's in nuclear reactor operator, was a senior vice president in the nuclear industry, I have a nuclear safety patent, and 3 peer-reviewed journal articles, as well as God knows how many times I've testified in front of different regulatory agencies about nuclear safety. You can tell I'm an old guy. I'm 73 years old. Diablo Canyon's design began when I was in 10th grade. They were designing this plant in 1965, and in 1967, they began to build a nuclear reactor. And when they welded the nuclear reactor together, they used the wrong metal. The metal causes embrittlement, which I'll get into in a minute. But they recognized in 1972 that they had the wrong metal in, and it was 15 years later when the unit started up. Yet they continued with the nuclear reactor that had the wrong metal in its welds. I wrote a report for Mothers for Peace, which is why I'm invited to speak today. It's 100 pages long, and I have like 4 minutes to give you the cliff notes on that 100-page report. Point number one is embrittlement, which I talked about. When they welded this nuclear reactor together, they put the wrong metal in. And as the reactor runs, the neutrons inside hit the wrong metal and cause it to weaken and essentially disintegrate. If the vessel cools down too fast, it'll shatter like glass. If it heats up too fast, it'll shatter like glass. This is the only disaster that the NRC evaluates, that it requires that the operators have to work perfectly. It requires that operator action has to come at exactly the right time. If the operators push the button too soon or too late, they'll crack the nuclear vessel. That creates something called the Class 9 nuclear accident, which is beyond imaginable. The nuclear reactor fails, the containment blows up, and then you have to evacuate depending on the wind, San Francisco or LA. Remember, when Fukushima had its meltdown, which I wrote a book about, the premier of Japan, a friend of mine, Naoto Kan, was faced with the possibility of evacuating Tokyo, which was 150 miles away. So an embrittled vessel at Diablo puts the state in exactly that same situation. So my report had 3 pieces: embrittlement, which the vessel cracks like glass unless the operators work perfectly. The second thing was deferred maintenance. In 2004, my report showed that Diablo asked for a 20-year extension before they did the inspection on this nuclear reactor vessel. So they knew in 2004 that they weren't going to run this plant beyond 2024 because the NRC gave them their exemption until 2025. So they've been deferring maintenance on this plant for 2 decades. My report talks about deferred maintenance on the doors into the control room, which have to be hermetically sealed. They were falling off with rust. Talks about a fan on the outside of the building that was designed to evacuate air. It was so rusty from the salt air that it fell off. Other people have discussed the outdoor piping, which rusted. The list goes on, and deferred maintenance at Diablo is not something new. It's gone back at least a decade or 2. Now, okay. And of course, Linda Seeley mentioned the proprietary issue where the inspections they have done, they're considering proprietary, which is an absolute joke. There's no such thing as a 5-year NRC license. They give 20-year licenses. And Diablo can't afford to make the repairs that are needed because of all this work they've pushed off in time. Diablo can't afford to make it and get a 5-year payback period. So they need 20 years. Whatever that bill says in it, Diablo is going to be licensed to continue to run for 20 years. And its costs to continue to operate are also going to be amortized out for 20 years. There's just no way. The last point of my report was seismic, and Dan had an excellent analysis of the the faults in the ground. And what my report talks about is something called the amplified response spectra, a technical word. So the foundation moves a little, but the top moves a lot. That's called amplification. The higher up in the building you go, the more it sways in an earthquake. I don't have to tell Californians about that. But what I did was I looked at the half a dozen to a dozen nuclear plants that had experienced a motion in the ground. And I looked at how much the top swayed. And the top of every nuclear power plant that's ever experienced an earthquake has swayed more than the designers ever anticipated. Well, what that tells me about Diablo is that when the big one hits, Diablo won't withstand it. There's just no way, based on the history of earthquakes at other nuclear plants around the country, that the amplified response spectra at the top of that building is adequate to prevent that structure from failing. You know, my report was used as part of these negotiations to get the deal between the organizations that signed on to close Diablo in 2024. And I really believe a deal is a deal. I mean, maybe I'm just an old guy and that's an old mentality, but you know, you enter into a deal, you got a deal. And it looks like Governor Newsom is threatening that.
Okay.
You know, if you want to spend a $1 billion, invest it in the transmission lines. The real grid instabilities in California are because of fires. So my bottom line is that Diablo is the least safe, the worst nuclear plant in the country. And that if a nuclear disaster were to occur, it will make the campfire look like a picnic. Thank you.
Thank you, Arnie. So I'm going to make a report from the No Nukes Action. We've been organizing since the Fukushima disaster to oppose the restarting of nuclear plants in Japan and also oppose the lies, the denialism of the Japanese and American government that says that they've been decommissioned and decontaminated. 11 years after Fukushima, they still have not been able to remove the rods, the melted rods in the plant. They still have to use tons and tons of water cooling this broken plant. This is 11 years after, and there are 1.3 million tons of water that they want to dump in the Pacific Ocean with tritium, contaminating the entire Pacific Ocean. This is the insanity and the danger to the world, not just Japan, of Fukushima. And now we have the situation in Ukraine as well. This is dangerous. And it needs to stop. And I think what we can say about our struggle is that the whistleblowers who've tried, the nuclear whistleblowers who've tried to speak out about this have been retaliated against, have been fired, both by the Nuclear Regulatory Commission and Cal OSHA, where whistleblowers have spoken out and putting their lives and careers in danger, and they've been retaliated against. And we have to recognize that these agencies have been captured. The NRC, Cal OSHA have been captured by the companies they're supposed to regulate, including PG&E. And I want to say that PG&E is criminally liable for explosions in San Bruno, for these fires, for the failure to do their job. Our position should be a public utility. It shouldn't be run by privatizers and profiteers, which is what we have now. And unfortunately, Gavin Newsom has a long record of colluding with PG&E to limit their liability, not going after them criminally and not holding them accountable for the damage, the deadly damage they've done to the people and the state of California. And this is a continuation. Now, the other thing I want to say is that the Democratic Party and the leadership of the Democratic Party, including Nancy Skinner, Scott Wiener, whose bill it was originally, which was gutted to put in new language, are in collusion with PG&E. And we want to hold them accountable. If they vote for this on Wednesday, we need to let the ratepayers and the people of California know they're in collusion with PG&E to stab them in the back again, because that's what they're doing. They're allowing PG&E to run California for its profit and to keep a dangerous nuclear plant going. So I say for us, we're going to hold them politically accountable. We had a press conference today in front of Nancy Skinner's office. She's chair of the Budget Committee of the Senate, a joint budget committee, and she conspired with PG&E and with Gavin Newsom to hold these secret hearings, which were not announced. The public in California, the ratepayers, the taxpayers, the people of California have not been informed of this deal. It's a last-minute sham that's being perpetrated on the people of California. So we have to say that these politicians, these Democrats who lead the legislature, have to be held accountable, and they've conspired with Gavin Newsom and PG&E to take this thing forward. So we're urging everyone to call their assemblyman, call their senator, and demand that they vote against this, and to hold them accountable for supporting PG&E, for supporting nuclear power when we're going to solar. The fact of the matter is solar is growing in California. There's 70,000 people who work on it. It's a growing industry, and PG&E as a monopoly wants to stop it, wants to stop solarization in California, as in Japan, which could be solarized, and they want to restart more nuclear plants in an earthquake zone in Japan to threaten the people of Japan, threaten the people of the world. So we urge people contact their assemblymen and senators, and we're saying that these people who are allowing this to go forward really have to be held accountable, and we urge people to stand up and organize against it. Our last speaker is Kathy Iwani with the Coalition for Nuclear Safety.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah. Thanks for having me today. As stated, I'm co-founder of Coalition for Nuclear Safety. I also have 2 daughters. Governor Newsom's proposal, Senate Bill 846, will be voted on tomorrow night. If passed, it will extend operations at Diablo Canyon Nuclear Facility. This is an outrage to Californians seeking reliable and safe energy for our state. Don't fall for the false claim that we'll experience blackouts without Diablo Canyon online. Diablo Canyon is not a dependable power source. According to NRC Commission data, Diablo averages 1 or both reactors being shut down 40% of every year. Extending the life of Diablo Canyon actually increases our risk for blackouts. Newsom knows that battery storage of our renewable energy is the answer in sunny California. And it's a travesty that Newsom hasn't prepared adequately enough for the severe weather events and climate change that we're experiencing by investing in appropriate battery storage to coincide with the legal and previously approved approved closure of Diablo Canyon in 2025. Battery storage and solar power my home and my car. It's widely known that storage will more than cover any loss from Diablo's closure. It gets worse. A sneaky solar tax has been added to this bill. Ratepayers will be charged a new fee based on gross energy consumption, including solar energy that powers solar users' homes and their batteries. Taxing the sun to pay for nuclear power discourages clean energy usage, and Gavin Newsom knows it. Newsom's plan grants $1.4 million as a forgivable loan from Californians to PG&E and exempts the convicted corporate felon from state safety regulations. There's nothing forgivable about this idea. When profits are privatized and losses are absorbed by the public without any concern for safety, you end up like Japan, a country which has paid dearly for its human error-ridden Fukushima disaster. I know, I witnessed the Fukushima triple nuclear meltdowns in real time and subsequently evacuated my family from Japan after 25 years of living there, raising a family, creating community. It's a life-changing event when you have to change the course of your life due to stupid mistakes like this. Okay. I watched as Japanese politicians prioritized relationships with TEPCO, the utility managing nuclear reactors in Fukushima, over listening to repeated warning signs from nuclear engineers the world over and activists alike. Citizens, so what happens when something like this, when you witness something like this? Citizens' dissenting voices are silenced. Distrust in government institutions is rampant. Cancer and radiation exposure-induced illnesses are censored in media, and the economy continues to tank. Do you see the parallels here with Gavin Newsom and PG&E? It's time to wake up. Currently, there is no federal plan to store our nation's radioactive waste. Letting Diablo run beyond its current licenses would add to the hundreds of tons of more high-level waste, lethal for hundreds of generations, to that already stored on site, allowing more waste to pile up at Diablo with no plan to store it safely into perpetuity simply hands this nuclear nightmare waste problem to our next generation. It's irresponsible, and it's an embarrassment for California. As a mother, I urge you all to hold your representatives accountable to vote no on Newsom's SB 846. California can keep Diablo on track to close in 2025. Thanks a lot.
Thank you, Kathy.